All right, here we go. Welcome to AppSec, Global AppSec in San Francisco. This is the DefectDojo talk. So we're going to talk about OWASP DefectDojo, your DevSecOps single source of truth. Who is me? I'm Matt Tesauro. I like to call myself a reformed programmer. My first job was as a developer, and then I got the security bug and left and have been doing security ever since. I am the CTA and co-founder of DefectDojo, Inc. I was on a whiteboard drawing out the design of DefectDojo back when I was running the product security team for Rackspace, and Rackspace is cloud. I've been involved in OWASP since 2008, so far too long. Not really, it's been great. I'm a core maintainer of DefectDojo. I do the OWASP podcast. I'm on the board of directors the global board of directors for OWASP. I was a co-leader of the AppSec pipeline, and I did a project called OWASP WTE back when doing like live CDs was cool, but that was a long time ago. I've got 22 years of using Floss and Linux, so I'm very much a Linux bigot. So if I do Linux-y things, that's me. This is a Linux laptop. Thank you, System76. I'm a Golang fanboy, and I do martial arts. That was me. This big old hunky boy got up enough to break 2 boards at once to get my 2nd degree black belt. It scared the crap out of me. But I didn't land on my backside, so we're all good. So let's do a quick introduction to DefectDojo. So you're told you're doing AppSec, right? And very likely, because I've done AppSec at a lot of places, you don't have any real idea of what your remit is. What are you in charge of? What is your problem space? Wherever you're starting with, if it's greenfield or burnt field, you need to start somewhere, and you're going to have to iterate on that, and it's going to have to grow over time. Tool vendors, if you use tool vendors, they're going to want you to log into one of their wonderful web consoles, right? And everybody loves logging into 87 different web consoles because, we love tabs. And the other thing is you're going to have these pockets of information across all of these different tabs. And wouldn't it be nice to have one single source of truth, right? That would take in all these disparate, different data, normalize it, make sense of it, dedupe it, allow you to filter it, sort it, modify it, get different views depending on the stakeholders, and otherwise just make it sane. Because otherwise I'm having to do this mental math in my head or trying to combine it in spreadsheets or whatever. It's just not all that great. So what solves all these problems I just mentioned? Right? So we went out and did a very, very highly scientific survey of DevSecOps and vulnerability management programs. And we asked, what tool do you use to solve this problem? Any idea? Like, let's be real, come on. Everyone's using Excel. It's disgusting and it shouldn't be. And every time I see that, I ask myself, why? Like, don't do that to yourself. There's better answers. It makes as much sense I put rain boots on my dog. That doesn't make sense. That's my dog. That's Jerry, by the way, when he was much younger. So instead, I'm going to suggest you use DefectDojo, because that's exactly why we created DefectDojo, was to solve those problems. So what is OWASP DefectDojo? It's a DevSecOps tool created by DevSecOps people for DevSecOps people. It's kind of funny when I talk to people who are like, oh, it's really cool you do that. I'm like, well, guess what? I used to run an AppSec program. I had to solve that problem too. Like, go figure, our software does that. So the whole idea is to manage an AppSec program. An interesting thing that came out of this, generally there are no inventory of applications when you go start to do AppSec somewhere. This becomes, in many places I've worked, DefectDojo became the de facto AppSec inventory because I was the first one to start actually tracking them using DefectDojo. Like I said earlier, you can sort, filter, and just manipulate the data in a ton of different ways. We use what are called engagements. An engagement is a feature of DefectDojo that allows you to combine the results of multiple scanners into sort of one reporting output, which is very handy. So I can run 4 or 5 tools, and instead of saying tool 1 says this, tool 2 says that, tool 3 says this other thing, I can just say I ran all these things, and the net of that is this, which is very useful. There's customizable dedupe and false positive tracking, which is really nice to save you some mental work of just having to keep track of those things. We've got custom reporting. There's tagging all over the place in DefectDojo. There's a calendar to help you keep track of how busy your team is. I found that great when I was when I ran a product team. And then there's historical knowledge of past assessments. So this is what DefectDojo looks like if you grab it today. It is, like I said, an OWASP project and open source. There is also a SaaS version that is a DefectDojo Pro that we use that money. Actually, most of the core maintainers of DefectDojo are actual members of DefectDojo Inc., which is kind of nice. We're supporting ourselves. We're a self-funding open source project, which is pretty sweet. There's also a dark mode in Pro, which is hilarious. I wouldn't think that would be a huge draw, but it really is. Who knew? It is a super active project. We are doing minor releases every month and bug fix releases for every week in between those monthly releases. So every week we're doing a release. We're in the top 20 of the OWASP, or the Open Source Security Index. These are too small for me to read. This was for May to June. We took we merged 126 pull requests. We're actually now at 238.3 or 4. I can't remember where we are right now. And this is primarily Django and Python. And then we hit a milestone earlier this year. We got our 10,000th pull request, which is pretty insane. We just kind of noticed that. We went, oh my goodness, this thing has got a few code changes over the years. But one of the things that DefectDojo says, as I mentioned earlier, is it normalizes findings or outputs from multiple scanners. We actually have over 180 different scanners that we can read in the data from, normalize, and make sense of. There's over 180 parsers in it. We also support CSV and JSON if you just want to push some custom data into DefectDojo. It doesn't really matter. When you're installing it, you have the choice of Docker Compose. There's a community contributed Helm chart. In full disclosure, the community contributed Helm chart is very full of options, to be polite. So I would use that as a framework to create your own. I wouldn't run that just as it is, just because everybody has a different way they like to do Kubernetes. I wrote the Go Dojo Iron installer. We are about to deprecate it. You shouldn't install Dojo on Iron. I mean, you can if you really, really want to, but we are using new enough Pythons that some of the OSs aren't shipping those Pythons, and then you get to this interesting case of having to shoehorn in a newer Python than your OS gives you, which is why Iron is getting to be painful. We created an AWS, AMI, if you want to just quickly launch. I think it's like 50 a month. It's a little kind of a proof of concept install. And then I mentioned earlier, we have that SaaS offering that helps support the project. So those are your install options. So what about DevSecOps and DefectDojo? How do those play? So I also, like I said, was the co-lead of the AppSec pipeline project. This was one of the outputs we made. This is sort of a high-level explanation of the different stages you will go through, particularly doing security automation, where you'll have some sort of intake. This could be regulation says I have to do this thing every quarter. This could be a merge happened between my feature branch and my main branch. Whatever it is, you have something that lands work on your plate, and now I have to handle it. Next step is to figure out how much to do triage and figure out how much effort how much effort is worth doing for that piece of work, right? Some things are really important to the business, and maybe you throw everything you have at it. Some things are less important to the business. Maybe you don't use as much resources on them. That really depends on risk. Because honestly, I should ask, who has too many people on their AppSec team? Oh, dang, no people hands raised. I saw one quietly in the back. You have too many people? Boy, people want to talk to you. I know all kinds of people that are hiring. Holy cow. But then after you triage them, you've got to test them. Now, hopefully this testing is automated, where you can quickly run through and have those things done. But once you've tested them, they need to go somewhere, right? You could push them directly, say, into a defect tracker like Jira or something. But honestly, is that really the best thing to do? Every single bit of output from your tool you want to go directly to a developer's backlog? Probably not, right? So one nice thing about having a vulnerability repository like DefectDojo here is I've got a place to pause, combine, mark false positives, do whatever I need to do before I push actually actionable findings down to developers. Or things like, I ran an SCA tool that says your library is out of date. Here are the 7 vulnerabilities in it. I have 7 issues. The fix is one fix, right? It's one thing to do, which is go update this library. Do I need to have 7 issues in Jira that say go update this library, or do I just need one, right? And which one are the dev teams going to like better? One, right? Unless they're trying to fudge their numbers, because closing 7 for 1 might be a bit of a game to play, but let's not go there. And then finally, deliver. This is where you're talking to your downstream stakeholders, right? You are running an AppSec program, presumably, to let your business know the state of the security of your software. Well, at some point, you're going to have to tell them that. And wouldn't it be nice if you could get these broad views and narrow views of that data, which DefectDojo will allow you to do? How is this particular product doing? How is this entire product group doing? How is this last test of this product doing? Those are all things that DefectDojo can answer for you. How many products are way behind SLA in terms of fixing issues? You can find that out with DefectDojo, because you've combined all those things together. So this is sort of the end state that I would love to see you get to, right? Where you have some sort of scanning or automation or CI/CD, a bunch of tools that pump results to DefectDojo. From there, you're pushing to issue trackers, marking false positives, maybe pushing data out of DefectDojo to do metrics. Maybe you have GRC, something like Archer. And then your developers can live in where they like to live, the issue tracker like Jira, and just fix things there. So what does all this get you if you do this kind of a thing? Well, some real world numbers from an example of someone using DefectDojo. They get an 840% increase in efficiency over 2 years. When they started, they were doing 44 assessments per year. When they finished, they were doing 414. And over those 2 years, they lost 5.5. No one got cut in half, but they lost 5.5 time person on their team. So they got smaller and went faster, which is pretty cool. And it's all about removing kind of paper cuts and doing some simple automation to make your life easier. So you as a AppSec person is focusing on the AppSec work, not this drudgery of like, did this happen in the last scan? Should I close it? Should I open it? Dojo can handle that stuff for you. Here's another example of an AppSec pipeline. This is one that a friend of mine did. They were very heavily Atlassian. So a developer would check in code to their source code repository, Stash in this case. That would send a webhook to a bit of code he wrote for an AppSec pipeline. That would launch a bunch of Dockers to test things. Those results would then get funneled to DefectDojo. They would push the findings to Jira, and then drop a message in Slack and said, hey, we just tested your thing. This is what we found. Give them an overview. With this setup, Aaron, it was my friend who did this, he was looking at 15 repos, and over 4 months, he did 5,100 runs of that pipeline for over 25,000 container executions. So you might not start at this ninja level, but if you have something in place that lets you do that automation, you can get to that kind of ninja level where you make scans be an easy button instead of a big, long, drawn-out process. The other thing about DefectDojo that I think a lot of people miss, or it's inherent, it's kind of easy to not think about, is there's 2 real places you can use to make scanners more accurate, right? Ideally, you can tune them in the scanner itself. Anybody who's tried to tune a scanner knows that some scanners give you lots of options, and some scanners, yeah, not so much. So if you're in the yeah, not so much option, what do? If you're pumping these results directly to Jira, you have no way to make them better. If they are instead getting parked in an intermediary like DefectDojo, this is a place where I can then go in and mark false positives, remove things that don't matter. Another great thing I've seen people do with Dojo, we just got SAST. We've never had SAST. We're going to run SAST against all of our code bases. Anybody who's just started doing SAST, do you have a few or a lot of results? Yeah, giggling means lots of results. So what you can do with something like DefectDojo is only import the criticals and highs. Boil those down to a reasonable number, and then add in the mediums, and then add in the lows, and slowly boil that frog, right? There's no way you're going to do all 10,000 vulnerabilities you found by running that first SAS scan, so let's make that number reasonable, right? And you can do that if you have something between you and the developers. Whew, okay. What's next for DefectDojo? So recently we did some deprecations. We were supporting MySQL and RabbitMQ. We are no longer as of the July release. We had supported Postgres, MySQL, Rabbit, and Redis. Quite honestly, our GitHub action testing matrix got to be insane. And we were running MySQL 5x still, even though 8 has been out for quite some time. We didn't have anybody in the community step up and add MySQL 8, so we deprecated it. And it's actually made our lives a lot better in terms of testing, which is really important. The other thing we're really working on is really increasing testing of all supported features, because we feel like DefectDojo has a really solid feature set. We just want to make sure that current and new code changes don't break things in Dojo. And so we're only allowing features we can test into DefectDojo. We're doing a whole rewrite of the UI framework that does our UI tests. And then we're also increasing API tests. And we're working on a process to show a diff of the API calls between releases. Because it's interesting now that I actually have customers using DefectDojo, we can do things like see how people are using it. And it seems like the customers that we interact with, about half of them are high 90% API usage, barely log into DefectDojo. The other half are high 90% UI, barely use the API, which was interesting to me. I primarily just worked against the API, honestly. And so that tells us that there's a good chunk of the user base that actually really cares about the APIs, so keeping that stable and not breaking it means people's integrations won't break. Then the other thing we're doing is updating. We just updated 501, I think, of the Django framework, and we've got another rev we're working on for the October release. And then over the summer, we celebrated 11 years as an open source project. This thing is actually 13 years old if you count when we actually created the first version internally at Rackspace, but 11 years ago, we released this as an open source project, and we are still going strong, which is pretty cool. We are beta testing a new UI, which is available to our pro customers right now, and we're looking at reskinning the API for our open source version as well. We don't have a solution for that yet, but that's one of the next things we're going to do. And then, I don't know where I am on time. I have a little bit of time. If you need more, because DefectDojo has incredible amounts of features, there is an hour-long talk I did with Tanya on the We Hack Purple YouTube channel, where I go way into depth on all the bits of DefectDojo, which I really don't have time for today, unfortunately. We have a booth. Come down and see us. We have cool swag, and I have stickers and bags up here if you want some cool DefectDojo stuff. And that's what I got, except for questions from you. So I'm happy to answer questions about DefectDojo. Going once, going twice. Someone's got to have a question. I'll give you a bag if you ask me a question, or a sticker. Oh, there you go.
Any thoughts on bringing in threat models if those apps have those available already?
Oh.
Risk scoring for the defects.
Love that question. Yes, someone just recently added threat modeler ability to, threat modeler outputs a format, and we have a parser now for threat modeler. I have in the past used the generic importer to take my findings from a threat model and turn them into a CSV that then I can.
Check 1, 2. Check.
Here's the mic.
You started? Repeat the question.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Input.
The question I didn't repeat was about threat modeling. The question that I just got was, Serif, do you have a parser for Serif? I would consider that a parser. What we do is work with Serif format for findings. Yep. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Talk about the fire hose of shit coming in.
Right?
What's a good strategy to actually just deal with that to start with? Because once the standards, lots of repos.
Okay, so the question was, and I'm going to paraphrase mildly, was when I hook all these scanners into this thing and I have this giant mound of data coming in, how do I make sense of that, right? There's a couple things. One, DefectDojo will deduping for you. So if you do import the same finding twice, we can notice that and just mark only one as being an active finding. Two, there is a re-import feature in DefectDojo that says, I scanned this thing today, or yesterday, and I scanned it today. This finding was in this scan. This finding wasn't in this scan. I'm going to automatically close that finding by doing a diff. So there's two ways you can drive down that just grunt work of dealing with vulnerabilities. And then three, the biggest thing I would say is what I mentioned earlier, only import the higher criticalities at first, to get a feel for what you've got going on. The other thing you can do, DefectDojo supports what's called cascading deletes. So for a lot of customers, I say, create what's called the half step back. The data model of Dojo says product type, product, engagement, test. So what I would suggest is create a product type called sandbox, right? This I'm gonna play, and do your import into a fake data structure and see what results you get. If it's really too loud, delete it. Dojo will just let you delete it all and try again. Maybe I'll see what happens if I import only mediums. Ooh, that's 10,000, that's too many. Let me just do highs and above. Oh, that's 5,000. Maybe I can live with that. So that kind of an idea, you can play around with importing data. It's not Dojo doesn't mind you deleting data, so those kind of experiments of doing imports are very, very easy to do and supported. It's a great question. Another question. I have bags and stickers, come on. I owe about 4 or 5. Any more? Going once, going twice? Oh.
Maybe just a quick one. Can you do custom status for vulnerabilities that are coming in? You want to triage?
Custom status in terms of the severity?
False positive, I think you already have one. Maybe could you do like risk accepted or something like that?
Oh, another great question. Yes, we support a bunch of different statuses on a finding. So when they come in, they will come in, generally speaking, as active. Active meaning it's open. For a class of our users, some people like to have a human verify them. So we also support the idea of active plus verified to say, scanner said this, and a human confirm that it's real. So you have that option. There is mitigated, there is closed, there is risk accepted, which has dates. We also have SLAs that you can attach at a product level, multiple SLAs that'll tell you, yes, this finding is within or outside of SLA. So yeah, there's all kinds of statuses around findings. Great question. Yes.
How does the ASVS benchmarking work within DefectDojo?
Oh, how does the ASVS benchmark work within DefectDojo? Well, first you enable it. And then secondly, if you go to the benchmark, there is depending on the level you select, the 3 levels of ASVS, you check the appropriate boxes of the controls that you have in place. And then there is also a checkbox to enable the display on the product page, and it'll show you how close you are to getting 100% compliance with ASVS. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, no, great question.
What's the roadmap looks like? What's coming next?
What's coming next? Oh, that's a great question. But we are looking at redoing the UI of the existing UI needs a refresh. It's pretty dated. I mean, I'm just going to admit that flat out. That's probably the biggest thing. We're doing a ton of internal things. They're not exciting or visible, but we've cleaned up a whole bunch of the statuses. We've cleaned up a whole bunch of things about re-import to make it quicker. This is another great thing about having customers. We have one customer who was doing 26,000 re-imports a day, plus adding a text file to every import that was a little text file of the metadata about that CI/CD run. And that caused us to do a whole bunch of rework in the innards of DefectDojo to make it even more performant. So unfortunately, or well, I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, unfortunately for you, they're not visible changes, but we've done a whole bunch of re-architecting inside of Dojo, ideally in preparation for the 3.0 release that we haven't quite gotten to yet, because we just needed to do some cleanup internally to set thumbs up to let us do those interesting things. Like the next thing that's going to get some love is the notification framework needs an update and some tweaking. So there's a whole bunch of internals that we're trying to solid up before we do the 3.0 release. Another great question, thank you. And you all get stickers and bags and whatever you want. Any others? Yeah. Will we be able to hide fields we don't use someday? Maybe. Yes, possibly. We are experimenting with that now, honestly, with the beta UI. And I imagine that work will be then used to inform the redo of the API that we're going to do for the existing UI. So yeah, that is definitely, there's a lot of like, please buy a scroll wheel if you're using the UI today, to be really honest. Scroll wheel is highly advised. Yeah, there's a bunch of ways we can do that. That's part of the cleanup work we're doing to better tell the templates that render those what fields are sort of the main fields, put those at the top at the very least, and then have a collapsible section for those. You may want them, you may not want them fields. No, great question. Another thing we did, actually, you're reminding me of like showing and not showing, is we added a configuration option to be verbose with API errors. Because for a set of users, if you don't have access to the shell wherever that thing is running, and the log says you sent a bad JSON, and here's why, but the API just gives you a whatever error message, that's not really useful. So we do now have a flag you can turn on to let those error messages be really blatant for the API, which was an interesting decision because, like, do you want to expose verbose errors or not? Well, I can make cases for both of those. And so we just let people choose. Yes?
When collecting events from different sources and you find that multiple sources are reporting the same issue, how do you select a notification that it's going to go in the Jira ticket from which of the tools?
Okay, so I'm going to repeat your question. The question was, if I have multiple tools pushing data into DefectDojo, how do I select which of those results end up going to Jira?
Yeah, if they are based on the same...
Right, if they have the same one or not. So there's a couple choices you have there. The first choice that we support that honestly I would not suggest you do, but it's there if you want to, is you can automatically push findings to Jira. Don't do that, but you can. What you can do is there's an option to group findings. You can group those related findings into one finding group and then send that as a group to Jira as a single Jira issue. So your 4 or 5 findings, like easy example, TLS configuration is bad, and I've had my scanner tell me 5 different ways that my TLS is bad. The fix is just update TLS. So you can combine those into a finding group and push the finding group as a single issue to Jira.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, we're late for the next.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Well, thank you very much. Come get some swag.